So if you remember, it's probably been a couple of weeks since you remember what we talked about. And just to give you a brief reminder of what we talked about, we saw 2 weeks ago the story of faith, where it begins. We saw Abraham, Father Abraham. We reminisced about that famous song, Father Abraham, if you remember that. It was fun. I sang it, and it was awesome. Well, I didn't really sing it. But we talked about Father Abraham. We talked about trusting God's promises before we see His promises fulfilled. Trusting that God will do what He says He will do. And so often in our lives, when we think about that concept, we see, faith. Faith is believing before you see. Okay, I understand that. I have faith. But then, as Mike Tyson, the famous scholar, the famous smart man that he was, said, everybody's got a plan until you get punched in the mouth. You know, we all have faith, or we all have this thought in our head that we'll be okay. And then life circumstances give us a punch in the mouth. And we wonder, is God really with us? Does He really care? And it's so hard to trust God when you go through incredibly difficult circumstances in life. And just on that idea, that thought of going through difficulty and still trusting that God has your best interests in heart, I want you to hear this story of a little boy named David. David was a 2-year-old with leukemia, and his mother, Deborah, came up to him and told him of his leukemia, told him of his disease, and they decided to aggressively treat his leukemia. And so he went to Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston to see Dr. John Truman, who specializes in treating children with cancer and various blood diseases. Dr. Truman's prognosis was devastating. He said that David had a 50-50 chance of surviving. The countless clinic visits, the blood tests, intravenous drugs, the fear and pain, the mother's ordeal can be almost as bad as the child's because she must stand by, unable to bear the pain herself. So you see the physical pain of your child and then the torment of the mother watching the child go through this. But David never cried. He never cried in the waiting room. Although his friends in the clinic had to hurt him and stick needles in him, he would hustle ahead of his mother with a big smile on his face each and every time, because he knew he was always going to get a welcome from his friends, the nurses and the doctors. When he was 3, David had to have a spinal tap. And if you know what a spinal tap is, that is incredibly painful, especially for a 3-year-old. And when he goes through it, they explained to him that because he was sick, Dr. Truman had to do something to make him better. And his mother had to say, with tears coming down her eyes, if it hurts, remember, it's because He loves you. The procedure was horrendous. It took 3 nurses to hold David still. And while he yelled and sobbed and struggled, when it was almost over, the tiny boy, soaked in sweat and tears, looked up at the doctor and gasped, "Thank you, Dr. Truman, for hurting me." The little boy had trust in his doctor. He had trust in his mother. And so he went through the most difficult and intense pain of his entire life. He still trusted that the doctor had his best interests in heart. And when we in our lives go through the most difficult and intense pain of our lives, when we watch a loved one go through it and we can't fix them, no matter how hard we try, do you still have the faith and the trust in the doctor that he knows what he's doing and that he still cares for you? Do you have that faith? And it's difficult. It's incredibly difficult to go through intense pain in your life and go, "Where are you, God? Where are you? Don't you see what I'm going through? Don't you care?" And it hurts so badly, especially when we have to watch those that we care about just suffer and we can't do anything to fix it. Do you still have faith in those moments? Do you still have faith? Do you still trust that God cares and that God is not trying to kill you? He's trying to make you better. Do you still trust that? Well, one of the ways that you can trust God, one of the ways that you can trust Him, is if you know that He's with you. that if you know that He's with you, that He has not left you, that He has not forsaken you, and that when you're going through the most difficult pain in your entire life, the doctor is still with you. The doctor is still by your side. And He's a good doctor, and He knows what He's doing. And as we look in our story today, as we look in our chapter today, we will pick up on that thing of how to continue to have faith when everything around you just falls apart. Because last time that we saw Abraham, we saw him have great faith when he didn't see the promise fulfilled. Today we will look at how to have faith, how to continue to have it. So let's pick up in Acts chapter 7, verse 9. And the patriarchs, jealous of Joseph, sold him into Egypt. But God was with him and rescued him out of all his afflictions and gave him favor and wisdom before Pharaoh, king of Egypt, who made him ruler over Egypt and over all his household. Now, when we first see these words, and the patriarchs, who are the patriarchs? Well, whenever we're studying the Bible and we have questions, we just go to the verses in front of us. So we look at verse 8. Look what verse 8 says. As we remembered last week, it says, and He gave them the covenant of circumcision. And that was talking about Abraham and his children. And it says, and so Abraham became the father of Isaac and circumcised him on the 8th day. And Isaac became the father of Jacob, and Jacob of the 12 patriarchs. And so Joseph is one of the 12 patriarchs, and it's basically 12 brothers together. The 12 brothers come together. And if you remember the story back in Genesis 37 and proceeding, actually, you'll remember the story of Joseph. Joseph has these brothers, and he knows that God has favor on him. He knows that God is going to do something big in his life. But his brothers become jealous. His brothers become jealous. How often, if you've grown up with a brother or a sister, was there sibling rivalry? Does anybody remember those days? Especially if it was an older brother, they would beat up on you, or older sister. I don't know if older sisters beat up on you, but I'm just going to say that they do. But older brothers beat up on you all the time. And there's jealousy because when you're the youngest one, you're the best, right? You're the best. And so there was jealousy among his brothers. And Joseph knew that God had a special calling on his life. And so what did his brothers do? His brothers became jealous of him. And they sold him into slavery. And when they sold him into slavery, they thought he was going to die. They thought that they would be able to get rid of him for the rest of his life. And so I want you to think for a moment, if you knew that God had a special calling on your life, that God had given you a special gift to use in this life, and then the people that were supposed to be the closest to you, the people that were supposed to care about you, sold you into slavery, took away your greatest gifts in life, and basically relegated you to a life and an existence that you hated. Wouldn't you feel extremely bitter? Wouldn't you feel very upset? Wouldn't you go, God, I thought you had a plan for my life. I thought you cared about me. And I'm in slavery? You're going to lead my entire life to bondage where I'll never get to do what I feel like I was meant to do. Really? Really, God? Do you really care? But here's the central idea that we will discuss today and what we will just camp out on. But God. That's what it says in verse 9. It says, but God was with him. God was with him. And today, if you don't remember anything else, you must remember that God is with you. You can't leave here today without knowing the fact that God is with you. And if you know that, if you believe that God is with you, it changes everything. It changes everything. You're like, I don't believe that. I don't believe that if God is with me, that it changes everything. Well, then you didn't read verse 10. Look at verse 10. But God was with them, and then here's what verse 10 says. And rescued him out of all his afflictions, and gave him favor and wisdom before Pharaoh, king of Egypt, who made him ruler over Egypt and over all his household. When you see that phrase, God was with him, it means that though Joseph was placed in terrible circumstances, God was protecting him. You might be going, how is he protecting him? Here's some commentary, here's some thoughts from scholars of what they said. They said, for God to be with someone means that God is present and working through that person in an unusual way. And in Joseph's case, it meant protection from harm. And as we talked about that little boy going through all of those treatments, God was with the little boy. He was with the mother as they watched the child go through pain. You might be going, but it was awful. It's awful what he's going through. Hey, I'm going to raise my hand and say it's awful what I'm going through. You don't know some of the things I've gone through in my life. Those horrible, horrible circumstances. And I can't even forget. Like I want sometimes so badly just to forget some of the awful pain I've had to go through. Do you really think that God was with me during all of that? Do you really believe that? I would say yes. Because when you look at the story of Joseph, and you can go back and read it in Genesis, you will see he went through some of the most awful, awful experiences in life. You might be going, well, how could God protect him from harm? Because God had a plan for Joseph. He had a plan for Joseph that was far bigger than what Joseph could ever imagine. And the way God protected him was not at all the way that he ever imagined. The way that God is protecting your life is not in a way that you could ever imagine. Because the reality is that although some people say, my entire life goal in working is to gain as much money as I possibly can. I feel like I've worked extremely difficult, but God's never given me the number that I always wanted to reach. He's never given me the riches that I've desired, and I've worked so hard for it. Would you believe it? That God is protecting you from harm? That God allows you to have the exact money that you have in the bank account that you have right now, even if it's much less than what you desire, for your protection. Because you don't know what you would be with a lot more money. God does know what you would be. You might be going, well, what about the pain in my life? As I watch my body deteriorate, and I go, God, why in the world am I starting to have these pains? I'm experiencing that myself. I can't do the things that I used to do. And a lot of times that just brings depression in my mind. Not like a severe one where you can't get out, but just like a moment where I feel like I've lost something. I've lost part of the youth that I'll never get back. And I can't do the things that I used to do. And I just put my head down and I'm just like, oh, I can't do what I used to do. And it hurts so badly for me because I'm used to being so active. But the reality is that God is protecting me. And you might be going, well, He's taken away something from me. You might be thinking that, but it's actually a blessing because I can't pursue what I used to pursue. I can pursue now what God has put in my path because I can't do what I used to do. And the same thing is true for your lives. Is that although you might be thinking that God is restricting you or God is putting you in circumstances that you just hate, it is for your good. It is for your good. And as we see this, as we see the story of Joseph, I want you to think for a moment of the three acts of God. And this is in verse 10. The three acts of God for Joseph when God was with him. The first thing is that God rescued him from his afflictions. God rescued Joseph from his afflictions. That's number one. Number two, He gave Joseph wisdom and favor. Wisdom and favor. And then the third thing, God made him governor over Egypt and Pharaoh's household. When God works in your life, He He rescues you. He rescues you. It might not be the way that you expect, but He does rescue you. And He will give you wisdom. The more you pursue after the Lord, the more you realize that God is with you, you will start to see that He gives you wisdom. He gives you wisdom and He gives you favor. And you never know what happens when you follow after the Lord. You don't know. You don't know 2 years in advance what one step in following after the Lord is. You might be like David, one day faithfully tending after the sheep. And then the next day, king over Israel. Same thing with Joseph. He was a slave. He thought that God's promises would probably not come true in his life. He probably thought that. You might be thinking that too. That God is done with me. There's no purpose left. I can't do anything else. There's nothing left for me. Don't believe that. It's a lie. It's a lie. Because if God is with you, He can take you from the jail cell, He can take you from being slave to being governor over all. He has that power. He has that power. But what are some of the applicational points that we see just from these tiny, tiny little verses? The first thing is a negative I want you to see, is that jealousy causes you to do harm. Jealousy always causes you to do harm, especially to those closest to you in your life. That is what we see in the story of Joseph. Why did he get sold into slavery? Because his brothers were jealous. In your actions with your children, with your spouse, with your family members, do not let jealousy kill your relationships. Do not let jealousy kill your relationships, because you will regret it. You will regret if you allow jealousy to destroy your relationships. And that is what you see in the story of Joseph later on, is that his brothers regretted the actions that they made in jealousy. And then some positives. If you believe that God is with you, if you truly believe that God is with you, then set your eyes on God and focus on Him and not your circumstances. Because if you will just focus on God, you will see that He is good. You will see that He is that good doctor. He knows what He's doing and He cares about you deeply. But if you just focus on your circumstances, you'll just get more and more depressed, because you won't be able to see how God will deliver you. But when you see Joseph, God delivered Joseph. He will deliver you. Set your eyes on God. Focus on Him. Focus on Him. And then the next point. Don't lose hope. Don't lose hope. Do not lose hope. You might be going, well, why? Seems like my circumstances are just getting worse. That's what happens in the story as we continue on. Look at verse 11. Now there came a famine throughout all Egypt and Canaan, and great affliction, and our fathers could find no food. But when Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent out our fathers on their first visit. And on the second visit, Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and Joseph's family became known to Pharaoh. So his brothers act in jealousy. They hurt their good brother, their young brother. They hurt him deeply. And then a famine comes in the land. Especially where Joseph is, there's a famine that comes in the land. Wouldn't you lose hope? Think for a moment if you were Joseph's brothers and you committed an act out of jealousy that you regretted your entire life. If you've committed an action against a spouse or a child or a family member and you feel like, I can never be forgiven. And you start to see your circumstances just start to get worse and worse and worse. When you see this idea of famine and they didn't see any food, well, when you see that word food, the Greek word for that is used for animal fodder. It's used for regular food. So it's even more intense. It may even suggest that not even the worst kind of food was available during this time. Not even dog food was available. That's how severe the famine was. And if you are those brothers and you have seen your brother go away, you think he died, and then God brings a famine, you're like, God is punishing me. Look at my circumstances. Look at my circumstances. I'm going to die of hunger. You know what? I deserve it because I didn't do the right thing. Don't lose hope. Don't believe that. Don't lose hope, because even for the wicked brothers, God rescues them. God comes to rescue even the people that aren't faithful. If you feel like, you know what, I continue to sin, I continue to do wrong against God, and I try, but I just keep failing, God even comes to rescue the unfaithful. Don't lose hope. God is with you. And when you see this, when you see that God is with you, you can do the right thing. You can do the right thing. Whatever decision that you have to make, you can do the right thing when you believe that God is with you. Because if you know that God is with you, then you know that whatever harm people may do to you, God will take care of it. Joseph couldn't respond. He couldn't get back at his brothers. He couldn't come in vengeance. But God does. God brings a famine. They cannot go on with life. They can't go on for what they've done. And so often in our own lives, when we've hurt those closest to us, we feel like we can't move past it. We can't move on. That's God working in your life. You must seek forgiveness. You must seek reconciliation. You must seek it. And when God is with you, when God works, when God does a work, you don't have to be afraid of who you are anymore. You don't have to be afraid. There's an interesting point that I didn't really know this until I was really studying this. It says that when they first saw him, in verse 12, but when Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent our fathers on their first visit. And if you remember that story, his brothers didn't even know who he was. Didn't know who he was. And Pharaoh kind of knew, oh, he's a Hebrew. But he really didn't know who he was either. Look at verse 13. And on the second visit, Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and Joseph's family became known to Pharaoh. And when you see this word family, it can also say race. In this verse, it makes clear that Pharaoh knew earlier that Joseph was a Hebrew. But this event when his brothers came, reinforced the Jewish identity in a very personal manner. Pharaoh knew who he was for the first time. He realized the kind of person that Joseph was. When you go through some of the most intense difficulty in your entire life, people might not even recognize you. Even your own family might not be able to recognize you. But God will display who you really are, and you will impress others. You might be going, why? Because God is with you. They will know who your true family is. They will know where you really come from. What you really set your hope on is in God. So don't lose hope. God is with you. Don't lose hope. And an applicational thought. Reconcile. Reconcile now. Reconcile with whoever you need to reconcile with. Reconcile now. And you might be going, wow, there's an event that nobody in this room will ever be able to escape. There's one event that nobody in this room can escape. What's that event? Let's pick it up in verse 14. It says, and Joseph sent and summoned Jacob, his father, and all his kindred, 75 persons in all. So there's that reconciliation. And Jacob went down into Egypt, and he died. He and our fathers. And they were carried back to Shechem and laid in a tomb that Abraham had bought for a sum of silver from the sons of Hamor, in Shechem. Nobody in this room will ever be able to escape death. Nobody in this room will ever be able to escape death. And nobody in this room knows exactly when they're going to die. Nobody. I don't even know when I'm going to die. Nobody knows. But reconcile with those you need to reconcile with before that day. Before that event, reconcile. Because you never know when that will be. And this is the story of Joseph. He might have thought when he was in slavery, he might have thought when he was in the jail cell, that he would never reconcile with his brothers. He had the opportunity to bring vengeance on his brothers, but instead he forgave. He forgave. And at the end of his life, he lived with his family. He lived in reconciliation, and he died in reconciliation with his family. When you know that God is with you, when you truly believe that God is with you, don't lose hope. Don't lose hope, especially with those that you seek reconciliation with. Especially with those you feel like you could never, ever in a lifetime reconcile with. Joseph's brothers threw him into slavery. In fact, they tried to kill him before that. That would be an incredibly difficult relationship to reconcile with. But he reconciled. He forgave. And when you know that God is with you, then you can reconcile. You might be going, well, why? Why can I reconcile? Because your Heavenly Father reconciles with you. Your Heavenly Father reconciles with you. He sent His one and only Son who lived the life that you should have lived, died the death that you should have died, and did something that nobody in this room can possibly do. He rose from the grave. He rose from the grave. Why? Because Jesus loved His Father. He loved His Father, and He loves you. He would go to great lengths to reconcile you to the Father. And He seeks the entire life to reconcile with you. Your entire life to seek reconciliation with you. And He goes to great cost. He goes to the cost of His own Son dying on the cross to reconcile with you. So don't lose hope. If God is with you, you can reconcile with those relationships that you feel like you could never, ever reconcile with. And when you have those moments, when you have those experiences and those circumstances, it says, you know what? It's awful. It's terrible. Like that little boy, I just watched those that I love the most go through some of the most intense pain, and I can't do anything about it. And I question if God is even with me, if God even cares, or if God is just simply punishing me. If you will believe and you will trust that God is with you, you won't lose hope. You won't lose hope because God is good. And He seeks your best. And just like that doctor, He is the specialist for your heart. He is the specialist for your life. He knows what He's doing. And if you have to go through pain, trust Him. Trust Him, trust Him, trust Him, because He is with you. And that is how we have faith, even when we don't see God fulfill His promises. Because when Abraham died, all we see is that son Isaac. He had Ishmael that went off his own. But when you see him, he didn't see the 12 patriarchs. He didn't see the multitudes of children that were going to come from him. He just believed that God would. And he knew that God was with him. And Joseph going through some of the most intense difficulty of his entire life. There's one little statement. There's one little statement that changed everything. But God was with him. And that one statement will change everything that you go through. Change everything. Because you will know that God is with you. So don't lose hope. And if there is someone, or there are multiple people that you know that you need to reconcile with, reconcile before it's too late. Reconcile before it's too late. Because you will not escape death. You will not. And it is a much, much, much awesome reality to have what Joseph had. Think about that reality, that beautiful reality that Joseph has in verse 14. And Joseph sent and summoned his father and all his kindred, 75 persons in all. And Jacob went down into Egypt, and he died, he and his family. He and our father. He and his family, they lived together and they died together. He had a choice. He could have sent them all off and died without them, and they could have all gone their separate ways. But he chose to forgive. He chose to reconcile. So choose to reconcile. Choose to reconcile. Because if jealousy is in your heart and jealousy is keeping you from it, you will regret it. You will regret it, I promise. So remember, as you leave here today, one thing to remember: God is with you. He is with you. He is with you. Let's pray. Father, it sounds simple. It sounds simple, and you know, Lord, when I was studying, that I just thought it was too simple, that you are with us. But God, I need to hear that. I need to know that when I make mistakes, and I make them all the time, and you know that, you see me for who I am, God. You see each one of us in this room for who we are, God. And when we go through such difficulty, it just hurts. It feels like you're not there, God. It feels like you don't care. God, but please don't let us believe that lie. May we believe the truth, God, that you are with us. That you are with us, God, and we have your favor. Please, God, help us to believe it so that we can have faith. That we can have faith. We can believe, God, without seeing. Because we trust you. And we trust that you are with us, God, please. We ask and we do pray, God. Be with us. Help us to realize that you are with us, we pray. In Christ's name.